All right, guys, this one's about functions and procedures. Now, in your A level, this is something that you guys have never covered. This is something new. Now, functions and procedures are essentially small programs within a bigger program. Okay. Now, your examiners will try and trick you with a number of different ways. They will call functions or procedures with different names, routines, subroutines, or even modules. Okay. Sometimes they might call them library routines, but that's slightly different. Okay. Now, what do we know about these things? Why do we care about these things? Or what's the point of me making a function or a procedure? Before I do that, let me clarify one thing. Your examiners, yes, they will try and trick you with these three different names for them, but the only reason that they use these three names beyond trying to confuse you is because sometimes they might be referring to both functions and procedures, and they are different in the sense of how they work. Okay, so if they mention routines or modules, for example, they might be talking about functions and procedures, or a bunch of functions and a few procedures, or something along the lines of that. So when you see these words, do not get confused. They're essentially talking about either functions or procedures. So what's the point of me making these mini programs in my main program? Well, the point of making a function or a procedure is that when I write it once, it means that I can use it multiple times in my program. Okay, and this essentially makes my solution much more manageable, as we can see here. Okay, also it says here subroutines may be independently tested and debugged, which means since they're tiny little programs by themselves, it means that I can actually just run that code to see if it works instead of running my whole program plus my subroutines. Okay, and in a sense, all of this makes it much easier for me to maintain my program. Okay, so what? Well, imagine we design a function to calculate the average of three numbers. This could be, I don't know, give or take 5, 6 lines of code. Instead of rewriting the same code over and over again to perform the same thing, we can call a function, which we created, uh, and we can call it multiple times in our program to perform the calculation. So essentially, I'm saving a bunch of lines of code, and when the function finishes what it was designed to do, it will return the value of the average. Okay, so functions essentially are little programs that return a value back to me. Now, in order for me to understand functions or how they work or how we are going to make them, we need to understand what on earth are parameters. Okay, so a function, in order for it to work, it usually requires certain values. What do we mean by that? Let's take the previous example. Let's say we are trying to calculate the average of three numbers. Okay, now in this situation, our parameters are likely to be the three values that we want to find the average of. For example, 10, 10, and 10 will be our parameters. But what we actually care about when we are designing a function or a procedure is not the values themselves, but the data type of those values. Okay, now I'm going to show you an example, and then we will expand on it a bit to see what your examiners might actually ask you to do. So here's an example. It says here, let's imagine we'll create a function to calculate the average of three integer numbers. For the sake of the example, let's imagine that those numbers are 10, 10, and 10. Okay? In this situation, the parameters would be the actual numbers required to perform the calculation. Okay? So that 10, 10, and 10 will be the numbers that we have to give to our function in order for it to perform the calculation. Okay, and I've got a little strategy written for you. It says here, first we need to declare the function by including the identifier, which means its name, alongside with its three parameters and what type of value we expect to be returned. In essence, what the answer will look like. So if I'm looking for the average of a few numbers, it's likely that the average will be in a decimal form. Now, with my example, 10, 10, and 10, the answer to the average will obviously be 10. It won't be decimal, but the chances of that happening over and over again are slim. Okay, so here I say part of my strategy is once the header is written, it's a matter of writing a few lines of code to perform the actual calculation, the calculation of finding the average. So here's the program that we're talking about. Let me zoom in a bit. Okay, so this is my function header. The function header begins with the word function, okay, and it's followed by the function name or identifier. Now you need to remember the word identifier because they use it often in your examinations. Okay, now after that, as you can see, we open brackets, okay, and inside here are my parameters, and I'm going to make these bold and underline them. Okay, let's ignore the spelling issues from Word. Okay, like so. All right. Now, as you can see, I have three parameters, one called A, one called B, and one called C. Notice that all three parameters are declared as integers, okay? Because the values that we're going to use for calculating the average are 10, 10, and 10, and all three of those are integers, okay? Okay. And if we continue on, you'll see here that it says returns with an S at the end, real, which means that the result of this function will be a real number. Okay, it will be a decimal number. Now, how does this work? Well, once our function's declared, okay, inside I created a new local variable. This is a variable that belongs to my function. Okay, so this cannot be used outside of my function. And if you take a look here, I said that the average is essentially equal to the three parameters, A plus B plus C, which is like saying 10 plus 10 plus 10, divided by 3. Once the calculation is performed, I know that my average is now equal to 10. So I will perform this return statement, and I will say return whatever is inside the average variable. Okay, so how would this actually look in a real program? Well, let's imagine that I'm going to write something here, and I'm going to draw a line. Let's use a shape. Okay. Right. Now, what am I going to show? In pretty much every single programming language, most programming languages, there is something called a main function. Okay. Now, most programmers don't really care how this actually works, but they care about one feature of this main function. Anything that's inside this main function will execute first. Okay, so for example here, if I declare three variables, num1, num2, num3, and I say they are integers, okay, and then I say output, whoops, like so. Just for the sake of things, I know this is very inefficient code, but I'll copy and paste it a few times. Oh, we're running out of space. Hang on. Right, okay, perfect. Num2 and num3, okay. Okay. Just by looking at this whole thing is one program. Now, the top part, as we've learned before, can be referred to as a subroutine, a routine, a module, or in this situation, realistically speaking, it's essentially a function. Okay. Now, the bottom part is my main program. Everything that you see here is part of the main program. Now, in your examinations, you will never have to do both. You will never have to write a function and the main program. You are usually writing functions or procedures. Okay. Now, they usually ask you to write functions or procedures, not the main program. Now, the reason I'm doing this is to illustrate how this whole thing would work. So essentially, if we take a look, okay, when the compiler reads this code, it will know that it will execute this line first, then this one, and so forth, okay? And up to now, this will not be executed because we haven't asked for it. We haven't used it yet. Now, in order to use it, okay, let's imagine that we have a variable called, I don't know, value, okay? And we're going to assign to it our average calculator function. Okay. Now, in order for me to use the average calculator function, I need to insert 3 parameters or 3 values that are of data type integer. Okay. So I could literally write 10, 10, 10, and once this is called, it means that this part of the code will be executed. It means that it will add 10 plus 10 plus 10, divide by 3, and it will return the average, which is 10, and that value will be inserted into the variable called value. Now, in this situation, though, my user has given me 3 numbers. Okay? Can you see these 3 variables? These 3 variables are integer variables. We define them up here. So in my function, I can insert those exact integer values. So let's see how it works. The program will begin. 3 variables will be declared, num1, num2, num3, and the user will be asked to enter a number. Whatever the user types, it will be stored in num1. Let's imagine that the user typed in 10. Okay, let me make this a different color so that we don't get confused. Then the user gets asked for another number. Let's imagine that the user gets asked for 10 again. Sorry, he inserts 10 again. Okay. And last but not least, he gets asked for another number, and lo and behold, he enters 10 again. Okay. Now, the next line of the code is an assignment statement, but instead of having me assign an actual value to it, I'm using my function, average calculator, and I'm inserting num1, num2, and num3 as my parameters. I can only insert integer parameters in my average calculator. Now, when this line is read, my program will leave the main section and it will come all the way to the top. And the first thing that it will do is it will check, okay, is the identifier correct? Yes. Okay. Has the user inserted a parameter that's an integer? Well, yes. Has he inserted another integer parameter? Yes. Has he inserted a third integer parameter? Yes. Okay. So essentially, my function is now ready to return a real number. Okay. Now, it will then go to this line and declare a variable called average of data type real. And then it will go to this line and it will use the 3 numbers we provided, okay, to perform a calculation. In this situation, the 3 numbers we provided were num1, num2, and num3, which are 10, 10, and 10, okay? And in my function, those 3 numbers are referred to as A, B, and C, okay? Once the calculation is performed, this will find 30 divided by 3, that's 10, okay? This line of code will send back the value of 10.0, okay, remember average is a real number, okay? It will return 10.0 back to my main program. So this will essentially mean this, okay? And once this is completed, this 10.0 will be put into the variable called value, okay? Now, what I want you to remember is that in your examinations, you will not have to create a main program and then jump into your functions. In your examination, they will ask you to define functions that do very specific things, much more complex than this stuff. Now, the reason that I'm showing you the main program is for you to get a grasp of what a function actually does. And for example, I could also keep on using this. So let's say that my program is repeated again and again, okay? And let's say with different values, like so. It means now that all I have to do is write one line of code to perform this calculation, this whole thing, okay? I don't have to rewrite everything over and over again. I could just call my average calculator and it will just do it, okay? So in this case, it will figure out that it's 20.0. Right. I am going to have a follow-up video to show a few more things that we can do with functions. I hope you enjoyed this one. I'll catch you in the next one.